All right, well, there'll be a few more folks trickling in as we go, but thank you everyone for making your way over here. I know it's hard to walk out of the barn or the theater and see the beautiful weather and then go back inside, so we appreciate that you came back inside. First talk today is going to be split by 3 speakers. The first presenter is going to be Caitlin Littlefield, a senior scientist at the Conservation Science Partners, and then I'm going to jump in, then Keith Thompson from the Department of Forest Parks and Vermont Department of Forest Parks and Recreation is going to jump in, and then myself, Jared Nunery, also from the Department of Forest Parks and Recreation, will follow up after that. So there's 3 of us packing a lot of information here to a late started talk. So we're going to go fast and wild and be a lot of information. So with that, Caitlin will start us off.
Well, I am originally from the suburbs of Boston, so I can talk really, really fast as needed. Okay. But I won't do that. So yes, thank you everybody for being here. I'm really glad for the opportunity to talk about some work that I know has ruffled some feathers of some folks at this conference, but that I hope can really contribute to our broader conversation of how we can protect holistically in an integrated manner the forests across New England. So both the wild places, passively managed, as well as those forests that we rely upon to support our wood resource needs and taking some responsibility for those needs. And across those 2 categories of the passive management and active management, the wildlands and the woodlands, how we can start to, or we can continue to restore old growth conditions and old forest conditions, which is after I present on the Beyond the Illusion report, I'll pass the mic, as Jared said, to Keith and Jared, who will speak to some of those strategies of getting there. So first off, I will be presenting on this report that came out last year that I co-authored with a number of folks, including David Foster and Brian Hall, who I know are here at this conference. And I do want to give just a little bit of background on the legacy of this work, including what's a really pretty provocative title, The Illusion of Preservation. And so that title is not new. That comes from ultimately reflecting a 20-year report out of Harvard Forest that David helped to co-author, David Foster, and as well as David Kittredge, who's now no longer with us. And the argument in this report was really what you see in the subtitle. So a global environmental argument for the local production of our natural resources. And this argument really laid bare the paradox in the state of Massachusetts that state is rightfully proud of its abundant forest cover and its conservation leadership, but that as a state it really produced almost and continues to produce very little of the wood products consumed therein. And so they made the argument that yes, we've got to protect more wild forests, but unless we also start to relocalize and sustainably produce some of the wood that we're consuming, that preservation of wild places is kind of illusory. It's undermined. And so that's really what we sought to revisit with this report here. And we following this original report, The Illusion of Preservation, emerged these frameworks, the Wildlands and Woodlands reports that you may well be familiar with and that has been certainly addressed here at this conference. And that's the kind of integrated framework that we're talking about here of promoting our wildlands and also promoting woodlands as well. So that balance and achieving both. So that's a little bit of the background of where this report is that I'll be presenting on today. And so I do want to just show this one figure, kind of a boring bar chart here, but this one figure that I do feel like really encompasses why it's important for us to address head on the need for both passively managed places here in our northeastern landscape, as well as sustainably and yes, actively managed places too, to meet our wood demands. So this figure here is from a recent study out of Nature that shows global biodiversity loss attributable to our outsourced harvests. And no surprise, so in other words, how much our global supply chains and the enormity of our consumption is really contributing to biodiversity loss globally. No surprise, the US is one of the primary culprit here. And so what you're seeing is that basically over 30 forest-dwelling animals have lost the entirety of their geographic ranges. That's not just chewing away at habitat, but the entirety of their geographic ranges due to our consumption in the US over 15 years. So that's something that I would assert we need to be starting to take some responsibility for. And furthermore, nearly half of the world's wood consumption is met by monoculture plantations, and it's about just over a third of the North Americans' wood consumption is met by monoculture plantations. And so, again, I would assert then that we really should be taking some responsibility for this, and that we can be doing so by relocalizing some of our production and consumption. There are also, of course, countless other reasons for doing so through that integrated approach of wildlands and woodlands. It's to help to address that kind of externality that I just showed. But other reasons, of course, include using these techniques across the wildlands and woodlands gradient to be promoting more forest habitat diversification, to be restoring that diversity, to help us pursue pathways of climate change adaptation and mitigation. So that's where that carbon piece fits in. For risk reduction purposes, especially of density-dependent agents, to support our forest-dependent communities as well that we know in rural areas are hurting. But I do think that per that graph I just showed, our capacity for environmental and social oversight within this region and taking on some of the responsibility for the wood that we are consuming and the forest products we're consuming is one of the primary reasons why I think we need to tackle this illusion of preservation. And so across that continuum of wildlands and woodlands, and we'll come back to this a couple times, and Jared in particular will dig into some of the practices, we really do have a gradient of achieving and restoring old growth conditions, both in, of course, the wild places, the unmanaged places, but as well as using some active practices to promote some of those conditions. And I see Bill in the background too, who a lot of this, structural complexity enhancement, a lot of these techniques that have been pioneered around this area to do so. So anyway, that's kind of the motivation for revisiting that original report, the illusion of preservation. And so we expanded it to ask that question for all of New England. So the primary question being, is New England producing as much wood as the region consumes? So I'm going to briefly walk through, not in depth, some of the methods that we use, but I'm really happy to answer any questions about data sources and methods later on, and some of the necessary assumptions that we had to apply here. But briefly, we drew our consumption estimates for lumber and pulp from some recent national per capita data from the U.S. Forest Service, and we adjusted this for income as well across each state. And then we also drew fuel wood consumption, that we set that equal to fuel wood production, because we just don't have a lot of good numbers on fuel wood consumption across the region. And then for production, we looked to state reports as well, but a lot of our states don't, with the exception of, well, I won't go there, but a lot of our states don't have fabulous record keeping in terms of the amount of production that comes out of the woods, especially when allocated to these different buckets. So we relied upon Forest Service standardized estimates across the region. So that's production as well. And then finally, a really modest piece is wood recovery. And so we use published data on construction and demolition and municipal solid waste about wood recovery. And we allocated that a little bit, mostly to fuel wood, some to pulp, and a touch to lumber. And so when you sum all those things up, you're adding recovery to production, and we're subtracting out our consumption. That gives us what the balance of each of these categories is for each of the New England states. So how are we doing then? I'm going to dig right into the results here. So all told, when we look at that net balance, New England produces about 3/4 of the wood that is consumed here. And so let's step through this figure then. You're looking at consumption on that right and production on the left. I'm not going to go into detail about each of the individual components for now, but suffice it to say, we got a pretty big gap there. We're producing about 60% of our lumber and 80% of the raw material for paper. Some might say, okay, well, 3/4 is not so bad. But it's really, I think, the disparities within the region between the New England states that are really particularly striking. And so Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island all produce under 10% of the wood that's consumed therein, despite being about 60% forested. New Hampshire and Vermont are about at parity, and Maine produces about 325% of the wood consumed therein. So as a region, we're getting 70% from Maine, 70% is consumed in the southern parts of our region, which you could say makes sense. That's where most of the people are. But I do think that as a region, for having about 2 acres of forest for every New Englander, that's about what the US has for every US resident. And the country as a whole is at parity. And we've got a lot of forest here. So I do think that we can step up our sustainable production of local wood products rather than relying on these regional disparities as well as global disparities. So what we then asked was, what would it take for New England to relocalize some of that production and sustainably produce as much wood as we consume rather than relying on other places? And so I'll step through 3 steps briefly that we should work towards to achieve that better balance by 2060. And that's protecting forests, reducing consumption, and extending ecological forestry. And again, in a couple places, I'll come back to how that restoration of old growth characteristics really can span that gradient of the wild places and the more actively managed places. So first off, nothing new to everybody here. We need to protect more of our forests. And we're relying upon that original wildlands and woodlands framework of calling for 10% of the landscape to be in wildlands and 60% in ecologically managed woodlands. Communities, farmlands, wetlands make up the rest. And this is crucial because we've got about 30,000 acres of forests are now being permanently lost each year across the region. And that's after the really incredible rebound that followed the land clearing of the early settlers and their heavily extractive forest practices early on, especially in the northern parts of our region. But we're starting to see the forest cover wane again as of about 2000. And that's due to urban sprawl, low density development, and so this is an image from up the road in Stowe of just of kind of perforating the forests, undermining their ecological integrity, as well as renewables. And so a recent Audubon report showed that in Massachusetts over a 5-year period, about a quarter of all natural land conversion was due to solar. We need renewables. Let's just put it on top of parking lots, right? Not forest. So obviously we need to be protecting more of our forests, and I do think this protection piece is kind of lost on many New Englanders when you can look out and see so much forest, 80% of our landscape, and yet we only have a quarter of our forests formally protected, whether wild places or woodlands, again, using that framework. Okay, so 10% of landscape in passively managed wildlands, 60% in actively ecologically managed woodlands. And again, which we'll return to, there are opportunities for old growth restoration across these 2 categories. Gets kind of darker green, I'll say, in the more wild places, of course, but then there are active management strategies for accelerating the old growth characteristic development that we can find too. So our second step, and I'm going to breeze through this, will come as no surprise, I think, anybody, we do need to reduce our consumption, 100%. We consume 4 times the amount of paper of anywhere else on the planet. Our single-family homes have gone from, in 1975, it was like 1,600 square feet, and now we're up to 2,800 square feet. We just consume too much. And so a key part of this, and protecting our forests, is reducing our consumption. And these are the parameters that we're calling for. So reducing lumber consumption by 25%, and we can still meet the affordable housing need projections that are out there while we do that, in part by multifamily housing with local wood, shrinking the size of some of our single-family homes, much more clustered development, repurposing old industrial buildings, et cetera, reducing paper consumption, and also increasing the recycled content. And the third step here is expanding ecological forestry and expanding our acreage in that across that 60% of the landscape. And so the goal of ecological forestry is really to sustain healthy, productive forests in a way that mimic the natural processes that unfold therein and that maintain the full array of ecosystem services, including timber production, that we rely upon. And that's by bringing them closer in structure, function, and composition to, again, those healthy natural forests. And so this is ecological forestry in general, but where does that question of old growth restoration fit in? And so I'm going to pull this figure here from the Old Growth publication by Tony D'Amato and Paul Catanzaro that gets at that continuum, that really describes how in the far left-hand edge, where you're really focused on old growth restoration, passive management is absolutely a viable, critical way to do so. But we do have this gradient, sort of lighter green gradient of active old growth restoration as well. In all cases, we're leaving more trees in the woods. Also, some on the ground, too. But this can be, across this gradient can represent one way in which we are helping to chip away at our consumption as well. So the restoration of old growth does not preclude our addressing those local resource needs. So those are our 3 steps then: protecting forests, reducing consumption, and expanding ecological forestry. And so the question then becomes, how much wood could ecological forestry sustainably produce, and how much acreage is needed for us to relocalize our production here in New England? And I'm not going to go into depth in a lot of these numbers, but what we've laid out is that basically 20 million acres is what would be required to meet our wood product needs if we follow some of these assumptions about how much production any given acre can generate on average. And we're calling for 50% of public lands, 50% of family forests and conservation organization lands, and 100% of corporate lands to be operating under this ecological forestry paradigm. And that's after withdrawing 10% of the landscape for wildlands. And we can actually do that with 20% of the landscape in wildlands as well, but we're sticking with that original framework. So, okay, just to show some final numbers here, what we've done, of course, is we've reduced consumption, we've increased recycled content and recovery, and that means we'll see a modest reduction, in fact, of our production, which is kind of wild. So we're relocalizing it, but we're actually going to be producing less, in no small part because we're reducing that consumption and we're shifting our management in a way towards longer-lived products versus lower-grade wood. So all told, in the end, by 2060, we're going to still see that Maine is disproportionately producing more wood for the region than the rest of the region. But Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island are getting a little closer to about a quarter of their wood production. And all told, the region as a whole is meeting its wood product needs locally. And so to compare that to 2020, you'll see that we have a much reduced consumption by 2060, and we do even with that reduced consumption, have a modest reduction in production as well. So how then do we get there? And this is where I'm going to start to hand it off. Oops, next slide. How do we get there? We do have some inkling of how we'll get there, although it won't be easy. And there are a number of factors that we need to consider. Reinvigorating our local rural economies, looking to our public lands, whether federal, state, community, as a potential model for a balanced approach to wild places as well as actively ecologically managed places. But also looking at our family forests. And I'm just going to leave you with a little glimpse of our family forests and the private forest land that really blankets our landscape that we should be focusing on, and just how tricky that might be. So achieving that integrated vision by 2060 is really going to rely a lot on family forest owners. And here's why it gets tricky. So all those green patches are conserved lands in the state of central Massachusetts. This is a screenshot from central Massachusetts. These are the private parcels. And what we're calling for is 50% of those to engage in forest stewardship as well. That's a lot of cats to herd, okay? So this is going to be really, I think, one of the trickiest pieces to getting to this vision of, at 2060, of relocalizing our production and absolutely protecting those wild and working forest places. To date, incentive programs have really largely not worked super well to engage a substantial portion of our family forest owners, but that's where the evolution of these programs, like Keith is about to speak to, with the reserve forest land category of Vermont's UVA program, can really help, as well as a number of emerging practices that Jared's going to get into about how we can be restoring old growth, even through that active management, while starting to chip away on private lands to meet our wood product needs. And so with that, I will hand it over to Keith.
Do you want questions at the end?
Yeah, if we can save questions to the end, please.
Thanks, Caitlin. So, Caitlin described a grand balancing act in our consumption, our management approaches, the kinds of conditions that we're trying to support, the management strategies that we're using to get there. And so as I give my presentation, I'm going to be focused on one aspect, one specific area, talking mostly about old forest management on private lands. This is in the context of managing for young forests. There are species across the landscape that we're responsible for supporting that depend on these unique conditions and the other values that these lands provide. We need ecologically managed mature forests, and we also need old forests and the variety of strategies that we use to get those. And in Vermont, we know old forest is absent as a functional component of the landscape. So it's not just enough to say, let's protect our old forest. We need to get more old forest. And the urgency that's been described at the conference makes it that much more important to use all the tools at our disposal to advance that, not just individual tools. So Vermont Conservation Design, one of Vermont's strategies to set targets for some of its goals, identifies approximately 9% or 419,000 acres of Vermont's forest land to be in an old forest condition. And right now we only have about 194,000 acres that are in a conservation condition that are likely to result in that old forest condition over time. And so if we need to get an additional 200,000 acres, where do we go? With 3.6 million acres, or 80% of Vermont's forest land owned by private landowners, it's clear we don't get to that point without private lands being involved. Vermont's current use program is one of the most successful conservation programs in the state. Its purpose is to preserve the working landscape, preserve the rural character of Vermont, and protect the natural ecological systems and natural resources of the forest land of Vermont. There's more to it, more to the purposes than just those, many more in fact. The program, as I said, is really successful. 55% of eligible forest land parcels are enrolled. About 70% of the eligible acres are enrolled. And so if you want to get to any targets in Vermont's forest land, it needs to be supported by the UVA program. And that's one of the challenges we recognized recently in the past few years. Just prior to 2010, there was a change in the program that allowed for ecologically significant treatment areas to be enrolled in the program, recognizing that for decades, the primary purpose of the program, almost exclusive purpose of the program, is to manage for saw timber. And when you're managing for saw timber, you're also maintaining forest land, you're getting a huge suite of benefits. And yet, there are places on the landscape where managing for timber can be in conflict with really important goals. And the ecologically significant treatment areas said, you know what, if it's old forest, if it's a riparian area, if it's a rare natural community and it exhibits these important features, it doesn't need to be managed for saw timber. And that was a really good improvement, and yet insufficient. Because if what we're doing is trying to protect the rare stuff we've got, that's great. But if we're trying to enhance or expand the things we've lost, that's insufficient. And so if we want to get to that target of 419,000 acres, we can't just be protecting the existing old forests, and we can't just carve off slivers of riparian areas to support that outcome. We need entire parcels to be able to be managed for old forest characteristics. Whether it be through passive or active management, we need those opportunities. And Amy Sheldon is here. She led a lot of this effort in coordination with FPR. We developed the reserve forest land category that first went into effect July 1st, 2023, which was an enrollment category that said some parcels, not all, but some parcels can be managed for old forest characteristics and the accrual and protection of those old forest functions and values. And so what that looks like is broadly in the program, there's managed forest land. And within that, there are enrollment subcategories, which now includes reserve forest land. And this is the big slide. Oh, let me go back real quick. This is kind of the big slide of where we're at today. And in some ways, this illustrates some great success. It presents a lot of opportunities for improvement. But I want to point some of the things out here. So not every property is eligible for enrollment in the program. The property needs to have certain significant ecological conditions at a certain threshold for a parcel to be eligible. The legislature set some of those thresholds, and making about 4,000 parcels eligible for enrollment in this subcategory across the state. Nearly 700,000 acres are eligible for enrollment in this category across the state. Right now, we have about 43 parcels and nearly 8,000 acres that have enrolled in the program. And in some ways, it's not even scratching the surface of the potential or need. On the other side, this is a program that requires a lot of landowner knowledge about what the options are. It requires support by foresters who are aware of this opportunity, can navigate it and promote it. And right now we've got about 20 plan preparers across the state who are preparing plans for landowners. They're more able to offer this at a lower cost than they could when they were first starting. There's a learning curve associated with it. And for context, I presented on this in April of 2024. At that time, a little bit more than a year ago, there were 14 parcels and about 1,200 acres enrolled. And so I think that we are moving in the right direction. There's more opportunity for awareness, way more opportunity for expansion, but we're making progress. Another really bright spot in this is the representation. And I spoke to Bob Zano about this. These parcels are in Addison, Berlin, Brattleboro, Bridgewater, Charlotte, Hardwick, Halifax, Heartland, Huntington, Morgan, Newfane, St. Johnsbury, Sharon, and more. These are places that aren't around the northern or southern Green Mountains. These are outside of these areas where there isn't representation. And that's great. Another thing about these is some of these properties are exclusively passive management. Other properties are being actively and passively managed on the same parcel. And so the opportunities to advance Old Forest in the ways that support the landowner's objectives and diversity of strategies are being pursued through this opportunity. And we're really excited to continue to expand use of this program or this enrollment option. It is disappointing for some landowners who are not eligible for this enrollment category. But one thing that this has helped us communicate and helped us emphasize is that reserve forest land or not, management for old forest characteristics and forest products are compatible. And that's what's necessary on the other lands enrolled in use value appraisal. And so managing for forest products to advance the old forest characteristics that the landowner may have as their objectives, they can do that. And so management for old forests is an option on all land enrolled in the program. And that's one of the important messages that we're sending to landowners and working on communicating that better than we have in the past and doing that well. And I'll pass it off to Jared to talk about some of the options for doing that.
Thanks, Keith. And we will hopefully get through this and have some time for question at the end. So I work here in Vermont as a county forester, and until the slide went up that Caitlin showed, showing all the cats to herd, I realized that I'm a professional cat herder because that is the space that I operate in, is working with all of those private landowners. So normally we have a lot of time. I go through this exercise with people because really today we're talking about forest structure. All right, and forest structure means different things to different people, but it's that feeling that you have. And so I'll go through this exercise where I have everyone close their eyes, go out to a forest and observe. And then we come back to that at the end of the talk and really see what you're noticing difference. But we don't have time for that today, so I told you about it, and I'm going to jump into those structural elements. The structural elements that we're talking about, and again, I'm talking about management for old forest structure, not management necessarily for old growth. That may be a more complex conversation, and we've already heard how hard that is to define, so I'm not going to try to define that. But we're talking about structural elements here, and really there's two pathways to do that. There's the two pathways being active management and passive management. That passive management strategy is highly effective, right? But it's the time it takes to develop it, to get to a forest condition that you have all those structural elements. We learned from Charlie's presentation, was it 6 generations yesterday? Not sure, but working through that. Call it 7, we'll round up and be consistent. So that length of time, you will get there, but it's the time it takes. Now, we know, as Keith just mentioned through Vermont Conservation Design, that we have a goal of having 9% of Vermont in that old forest condition. If we could magically wave a wand and set aside that acreage that doesn't achieve the function of having that 9% functional old forest condition. So in the interim, there are active management strategies that we can use, and there's a lot of research that's been on this, and just going through. This isn't even touching the bit of research on old forest structure in the Northeast. Charlie began, I think, before I was born. I learned today, like Jerry Franklin's first paper came out 3 months before I was born in 1981. And so it's been going on for a while, but really there's been an uptick in this idea in the practice of ecological silviculture, where we've taken that work that we heard about this morning in the plenary from the Pacific Northwest and brought that, and this isn't that recent. Bill Keaton started this work 20 years ago and published it 25. Well, the work began 25, but the paper came out a few years later. So this work has been going on. And we have this, and then most recently, and this is where I'm going to pull a lot from as we go through structures, the work that Tony D'Amato and Paul Catanzaro came out with, and this restoring old growth characteristics and giving us some key metrics to manage for. And so just getting into that time element again, and this is from Tony and Paul's paper as well, is we're kind of, you can see where we're at in that 100-year range, most of our forests. To get to those characteristics takes a lot of time. And so we can set aside land that will get us there through passive management. And in the interim, through active management strategies, we can start to get some of that function, the function of the structural elements of old forests in our forests that we're in today. And so this kind of gets into where the rubber hits the road, what we're doing here in our forests in Vermont, what active private landowners are doing, and that's who I work with. So the first step going through is starting out and identifying what have you got. Because if you have structural elements, keeping those. You don't reinvent the wheel. I threw out this big piece of dead wood. I don't know, Charlie, if you recognize this one or not, but this one's from Lord's Hill. But pretend that wasn't Lord's Hill, because this scenario's come up before on private landowners that I've worked with that have trail systems. And we have very few big trees in the woods. And you have fewer big trees that fall over and then are there. And if a big tree falls over and crosses a trail, what do we do?
The trail.
Well, those were the conversations we started having. And this morning, I was out for a run, actually, right in the trail system over here. And I started going up, it was kind of dark still, a bridge. And I realized that the bridge wasn't crossing a stream, the bridge was crossing a log. And that was pretty cool. And I don't know if it was just for the excitement, it was a mountain bike trail to get a little more excitement, but that's the type of conversations, and it's where we value. If we have this same tree and it's standing upright and we're putting in a mountain bike trail, I highly doubt we would cut that tree in order to put the trail through it. We go around it. So it's how we're valuing these structural elements. And when we have them, keeping them, protecting them, integrating them into our management. The other that we commonly say is embrace the mess. Because this is really a messy process. And there we have, as human beings, a neat and tidy nature. And neat and tidy in the woods is not, and I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, but we know the mess is part of it. And that mess comes in different forms. The first is as we start to break up our canopy. And this work, again, is not new. And I have up here work that Foresters for the Birds or silviculture with bird. There's lots of different iterations of this work that Audubon's been doing for years, but looking at structural elements of the forest and how that relates to individual bird habitat. This ties into old forest structure as well. As we start to develop more age classes in our forests, we develop more strata in our canopy, and we get continuity, vertical structure in our forest. There's a lot of jargony words for all this, but the important thing is we get that structural element, we start to get the function. We start to get black-throated blue warblers nesting in that lower strata. Same thing across the canopy as itself. We've heard about this morning in the plenary session, the roughness in the canopy. That roughness in the canopy starts as we start to break up the canopy for the adding horizontal structure, creating those canopy openings. With that, we get more function, that function for different birds. So we've started to tie this into our practice in forestry here in Vermont in different ways. 15 years ago, we were doing it with birds in mind, and then Tony and Paul's work came out, and now we're doing it with old forest structure in mind, but it's all quite similar. The other part of it is big trees. There's really only one way to get big trees, and that's to keep growing. But you can accelerate the growth on those big trees. Here in Vermont, we have great soil. We generally have plenty of water, with the exception of the last month or so, but our limiting factor in our forests for growth and controlling growth is sunlight. And so we can accelerate the just growth, get bigger trees faster through thinnings. And we get these metrics from Tony and Paul's work that give us guidance on how many trees to leave. And really the tweaks, the knobs that we're turning and our private landowners are doing as they're developing these and implementing these practices are, well, we may have in the past done this amount of thinning. Well, we're going to change it slightly. We're also going to integrate retention. Retention is a critical one. Again, it's keep what you have. So we're going to have trees that we mark. We leave trees where we're going to keep, whether or not it's for seed or just to have large trees within the forest to continue. So retention becomes a really important consideration. And this is where we start, and you see these gray boxes to integrate the metrics from Paul and Tony's, where now we actually have these numbers that we can say, oh, if we have this forest type, northern hardwood forest, we want to have, our goal is 12 to 20 trees greater than 20 inches in diameter. Now we have targets to manage towards. So we have this information available to us as managers, and we have landowners practicing this. But we have to think beyond the big trees. Even though Bob loves looking at big trees, you got to look beyond that to more. And so, again, we talked about those holes in the forest earlier, the horizontal structure, developing multiple age classes. Most of our forests, we talked briefly about earlier, 1 to 2 age classes. Really, we should be 3, 4 age classes, having lots of trees of different ages in the forest. And we're starting to do that. Our forests are getting older. They'll do it on their own. Something I tell landowners regularly is our forests don't need us, but we need them. And so where we're practicing active management, we can tweak the knobs a little bit and start to accelerate some of these structural elements associated with old forests. This is probably the biggest one that's lacking in our forests. We've heard this in a couple of the presenters so far, but that down dead material, down dead wood, getting that really, to get big down dead wood, you first have to grow a big tree. Once you have that big tree and it falls, then it's a matter of leaving it there. But we may also be cutting. Now you can see like a C and an L on that tree, and that operator knows when they see that, I'm going to harvest that tree, and then I'm just going to leave it right there on the ground. And so now we also have targets for how many of these cut and leave trees we should be integrating into our harvest. Tony D'Amato's even added morticulture, so new terminology where we can integrate this management of dead trees and dead wood into our forest, because really in Vermont, I'd say this is the hardest one to get too, because to get trees of different sizes, trees of different decay classes, that takes time. And so this is going to be something that it's not a one and done, not one harvest. All right, I got my dead wood. This has to be integrated into regular management over a longer period of time. It's got to become the normal. So, and lastly, the recruitment of standing dead trees. And we did this, this is not new either. Wildlife biologists started encouraging this a long time ago through girdling of trees. The challenge is you girdle a tree, it's not the same thing as when a tree dies on its own. Especially some of our hardwoods that will rot out from the inside, and so you actually have a hollow tree that then becomes a bear den even, and so that takes time. So where we have those trees, they're critically important to keep on the landscape and protect those trees, those standing dead trees. Not to say you can't girdle some trees to create a few more snags as well, but really that's not the best way. Thinking about it, and then thinking about as you're growing some of those larger trees, that some of those are going to become standing dead trees and then become coarse woody material when they fall. And so starting to recognize that there's a permanent element to your legacy retention in all of your management practices. So with that rapid whirlwind, I caught us up and got us into time where we actually have time for questions. So I promised we were going to come back to it. And I'll just say I cited a lot of the information that I just rapidly cruised through came from this pamphlet here, which you can get at the website below. But first question, because you asked before while we were getting going, if you'd like to start. And Keith and Caitlin, if you want to come up.
I have a lot of questions.
How about one to start, and then we'll spread it around.
I'll give people my questions. Well, did you look at how much wood Massachusetts exports? When you did this study and said And I didn't, along with that, how are we gonna reduce consumption? Because you didn't really go into that. So,
So the question,
I
if you want to repeat.
believe that Massachusetts exports a lot of wood that it harvests. So instead of cutting more wood in Massachusetts, how can we stop exporting wood? And it's mostly, a lot of it's for biomass, which is the polluting fuel.
Well, let's do biomass over beer later, okay? But I wish I had an answer for you. But so I have two things to say about that. I don't know exactly how much Massachusetts exports. I don't know exactly how much any of our states export. And that was one thing that this effort really revealed, is that we don't have a great accounting for where our wood is going within the states, within the region and within the country. And so I don't have a solid number for you on that. Even so, I think that was one thing that's revealed to me, is that if we want to really be reining in production or consumption and production to a degree, we need to have a better accounting system across states.
The data doesn't exist on where it's going?
I've spent, I'm going to say, weeks, if not months of my life digging into trying to trace where our wood flows within the region. And it is hard to track down. So we don't have a really solid number about that, no. Especially across all the different categories of saw timber, of pulp, and of especially fuel wood. But my suspicion, though, is that given how much harvesting does happen, it is still a tiny fraction of what is actually, I'll just say, needed to address the consumption that occurs within that state. So even if we were to just relocalize all keep all the wood in the state, it'd still be close to like 10% of what is actually being consumed therein.
I don't know.
Yeah, I know. I don't either. That's one of the tricky things here. Yeah, but thanks for your question. Yeah.
Okay, let's all the way to the back.
Hi. Just a quick question. If I have the terminology right, for reserve forest land, category current use, what's the minimum acreage for that? Because current use is normally 25 acres, right? Is the reserve?
Yeah. The question is,
for a current use kind of character, to apply to manage, like the reserve forest land. Is that still a 25-acre minimum?
yeah, so the question is, what's the minimum acreage for enrollment in reserve forest land? It is the same as it is for other forest land parcels, which is 25 acres. Yep.
Okay, right over here.
So, two things. I have this impression that a lot of lumber yards have a lot of waste. I see, stacks and stacks of 2x that are twisted and bent in the woods. And so I wonder if there's any way to, rein that in. And the other piece is when you are managing forests to try and replicate some old growth characteristics and I guess selectively cutting, is there a way that you're compensating the landowner for what they might make if they are just, harvesting it quicker and selling it up quicker? And also the variety of what they're cutting, because I imagine different woods have different, price points or whatever.
We said only one question. You gave me three, but I'll see what I can do. So the first was the waste in the mills. And I'll say the waste in the mills, it's to the mill's advantage to have zero waste because that's a economic loss for them. So I think as mills have become more modernized, you see less and less waste, particularly your most modern mills. And so there's an incentive even for a mill not to do that. It may be if you saw a particular mill, they may want to work with someone to increase their efficiencies.
It's the lumberyard themselves, the sales point, not
Sure.
the production, yeah.
And then your question about the second part was compensation. Yes, thank you. So the question was, if you're doing these practices, are you being compensated differently? And I think that is where, as a landowner, you're making that choice that you're going to have less revenue from that harvest because there's a cost to this, right? So that is going to be a landowner's choice and your objectives. If I'm going to manage for old forests, my economic return is going to be lower from what the extract from the woods. And so that's going to be a landowner choice.
There's no tax incentive, right?
Not at this time. that could be in the policy discussion something that comes out of it. And maybe that's a parallel conversation that could happen. But right now, no. There are some to do timber stand improvement work and some other cost share programs that are out there that maybe some elements of this, even some of the bird friendly, the Foresters for the Birds work, some of that is part of cost share programs, but a lot of what I've talked about is going to be a reduction in the revenue to the landowner. We have time for probably one more. Do you want to pick?
No, you were in the room, you were the first in the room, so you get, yes, okay.
Okay, well, my question is for you.
Okay.
So I'm coming from Maine, which has a pretty different breakdown in terms of who owns our woodland, with a much larger proportion being in private and specifically corporate and industrial forest management. And, you know, I would just love to hear a little bit more about that. I remember reading from your report essentially saying the way these ownership models are set up is we're unlikely to be able to affect as much implementation of ecological forestry methods with these types of ownerships, which are mostly investor-based now, without either consumers being willing to pay more for premium product or a change in ownership.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, how should we be thinking about the corporate ownership of the Maine woods in relation to trying to encourage better forestry practices on private land?
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the toughest nuts to crack about this. Oh, sorry. So the question being, how do we address corporate ownerships in Maine in particular, if that is a major part of the landscape there? So how might we encourage more ecological forest management on those parcels? And I think and it was Chris, right? Yeah, I think, Chris, you mentioned it, it's consumer willingness to pay. And I think that does get at, and to your question as well, of just this requires a bit, I mean, we do need this. We need a cultural shift around how we value we're surrounded by wood right now. Our houses are all built of wood right now. Who doesn't have a wood table in their house? We just use so much of it. And so yes, we need to reduce that, but we also need to start, I think, being willing to pay the premiums for it instead of popping onto Amazon and ordering that teak deck set. And that's going to cost money. And so I don't know what the answer is for that, but I do think in the same way that we've had this incredible celebration of local agriculture, especially in our region, what does it mean to be celebrating relocalized production of wood while also getting to a place where you have better representation of our old forests on the landscape too? So you tell me. There you go.
Well, with that, we got to give you a little bit of a break in time to get to a different session if you want to go to a different session, or if you'd like to stay here, Amy Sheldon will be giving a great talk that's starting in just a few minutes. So thank you all.